Hi, everyone. I'm Ramona Hattendorf. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Civic Engagement at the ARC of King County. Thank you for joining today. This is our presentation on the right to inclusive learning. This is part two of our Accessibility and Belonging in Public Accessibility and Belonging in Public Schools series. The questions usually ask, yes, I will be sending out a link to the recording afterwards. I will also send out a PDF of the presentation for folks afterwards. So you have that as well. Okay. So first of all, what is this series? This is part of a Navigating in School series, specifically accessibility and belonging. We'll also be doing some special education basics as part of this series. So if you're new to special education, you kind of want like some 10 tips to advocacy, you want a little bit more information about due process and how to navigate conflict, we'll have classes later this spring on that. We are also offering that sequence. It's a sequence of 3 classes in Spanish as well. We also, at the same time, we're doing 2 other parts of this. One's called Understanding Disability, and this is just more about disability education, disability awareness. It's for families, but we're really targeted. Families are welcome, but we're really targeting this towards professionals in the field, educators and other professionals who support people with disabilities and who maybe aren't super familiar with disability. So there's that series, and then there's Insights on Supporting Families, and this one is targeted for educators and other professionals who work with families who have children with disabilities. So all of those are available, and we will be recording them, and we'll be posting the recordings on our website and materials on the website. So you'll be able to access those all spring. And why are we doing this? This presentation is part of a series of workshops through the state's Inclusionary Practices Technical Assistance Network. I have a link to that. This is a project that's been going on for several years at the state level. It's a collaboration between the Office of the Superintendent of Public Construction. If you're not familiar, they help oversee the state's schools. Your local school district is in charge of running your particular school district, but they oversee like the funding, standards, and they have a lot of influence also over special education services specifically. Also, West Ed is one of their partners in administering what they call the IPTN. And then one of those they have partners all across the state, and one of them is something called the Family Engagement Collaborative. And we're part of the Family Engagement Collaborative. It's the ARC of King County, it's PAVE. It is the Northwest Education, and it is also Roots of Inclusion. So we're all collaboratively doing work to support the IPTN this year. And as I said earlier, we're hosting various webinars, and you're free to check those out as well. And who we are, in case you're not familiar, the ARC of King County promotes and protects the rights of people with intellectual or other developmental disabilities so we can all all live, learn, work, and play in the community. Really what we want meaningful involvement, meaningful access to education, meaningful access to work, meaningful access to just be able to make decisions to live the life the way you want. At our chapter of the ARC, we offer information and family support services. We offer systems navigation, education and civic engagement support, and we also run a supported living community residential program for adults living with intellectual or other developmental disabilities. We can help on a lot of topics. If we don't have the expertise in-house, we can refer you to someone else. So if you need assistance, please do contact us. The best way is through email at our ask@arcofkingcounty.org. And I have this information on this slide, a link to our website, a link to the Ask Get Information hotline, and then also my contact information is on there as well. So launching on today's topic. First, I just want to give a very brief overview to ground us. And you'll notice that during this presentation, I repeat a few themes, and I do that just to help absorb the information because legal things can be they might be intimidating or they may not sink if you're not really used to this legal language. So I really try to zero in mostly today on this concept of least restricted environment. It was just really, really essential to the legal status or the legal parameters of what is inclusive learning, and what your students' rights are to inclusion. So you'll find I repeat it really high level, a little mid-level, and then I go a little bit deeper onto some of the specifics. So super high level, but what I hope you take away today is that public education needs to work for all students. And this is not just a moral statement. This is also a legal statement. As you'll learn through the rest of the presentation, there are federal and state laws in place where, yes, students with disabilities, it also needs to work for them. So that is really key to understanding. There's some basic rights associated. For instance, equal opportunity to benefit and equal opportunity to participate. Schools cannot deny access to students with disabilities or require students with disabilities to be educated separately just because they have a disability. Individualized instruction does not mean services need to be provided in a segregated setting. These are all basic civil rights. We're going to go into, I'll go into a little bit into what these different laws are, but this is a key takeaway, is that there's an equal opportunity to benefit, an equal opportunity to participate. And this, by the way, it doesn't even have anything to do with IDEA. This has to do with other federal civil rights law. And it's very important that you know that if you are working with or supporting someone with a disability. Special education, then, it's not a place. That's also a key point. Special education services, they are in place to ensure access to education and access to the general education. They are not intended to be a separate, they are intended to give you access to learning. IDEA stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that spells out the rules for special education services. There's also two other really important pieces of federal legislation. One is, well, the overall bill is called the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and specifically there's something in there called Section 504. So Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, is a really foundational law that it was the first one that really advanced the disability rights, and it was linked to entities that have federal funding. Sometimes in schools, you know, like Section 504, somebody might have a Section 504 plan in place of an IEP, and that refers to this, but this law is way bigger than a Section 504 plan in a public school. There's also the other key piece of legislation is the Americans with Disability Act, and specifically Title II. There's different titles in this act. Some of them go into employment. Some of them goes into public spaces. Title II is about local and state government services, public services, and the right to equal access and equal opportunity to those public services. So that's a really fundamental law also with student rights in our schools. And so together, and again, we're going to go into these details, but together, the IDEA, so the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, long bill, and Title II of the American with Disabilities Act, collectively, these three really give us a legal framework for inclusion in our public schools. It's also, we're not going, I did a separate class on the on the research basis. I'm not going to go into the research basis today, but I want you to know about it because it comes into play. You'll hear a lot like appropriate. It needs to be as appropriate. And like, what does appropriate mean? And appropriate can be very subjective. But one thing I would argue, and I encourage families to understand, is that if the research all solidly backs one certain thing, then I think you could certainly make the case that that would be inappropriate. It's research backed, there's a legal basis for it, that would make it appropriate. So the research comes in, and what we know from research is that decades, 50, 60 years worth of research are showing that children with disabilities are not thriving in segregated classrooms. And it can be a variety of reasons. might be very individual to the student, but some of the overarching ones seem to be, they might feel isolated in the school. They don't have a sense of belonging that affects their, just their ability to learn. They may not have access to core curriculum or certain subjects. If they are in a separate, do they have the same access, say, to subject matter? Do they have access to history and civics? And it can either be, do they have access to the subject matter experts in the school, or do they have curriculum that is really presented in a way that's accessible to them? So they may not have access to certain subject matters, or they may be denied opportunity because of low expectations. People don't think they can learn, and therefore they don't offer them an opportunity to learn. This gets hit home. We work with people of all ages, and one of the most heartbreaking things I hear is when adults are reaching out and they want something, they want to learn something. Some of them, at a most fundamental level, they go, "Will you teach me how to read? I want to learn how to read." These are adults. They went through our public schools. You would hope they had the opportunity to learn how to read. They certainly have the desire to learn how to read. But some people at one point, hopefully we're not seeing this anymore, but we've come across this, wait, we're supposed to put reading into the IEP? And no, you should not have to put reading into the IEP. But unfortunately, we do see that. So just know that the research basis says that there are some problems, there are some flags sometimes with segregated classrooms where they're not getting the same opportunity. They certainly do not seem to be learning as well. And again, that's going to come into this concept of appropriate. So now I'm going to go a little bit into the details. Again, talking about this legal foundation. So you need to know the term inclusion, that's not in the law. They don't use the word inclusion. But as I said before, there really is a legal foundation for inclusive learning. And this is really pulled out, especially, it was a public policy document. It was first released in 2015. It was updated and re-released last year. And it laid out the legal and research basis for inclusion. And so in the IDA, they have this concept of equal education opportunities. In IDA, they also have this concept of natural environments. Earlier, before we started recording, somebody mentioned Part C and Part B. So IDEA is this big federal law. Part B, those are your special education services. They actually start at age 3 and they can continue until age 21. Now, not everyone's going to get them at age 3, and not everyone's going to continue to age 21, but that's the scope of what Part C, Part B, as in boy, covers. Part C was added a little bit later. It wasn't in the initial legislation. Part C is for supports for infants and toddlers, so ages 0 up to age 3. And then they would do their early supports, and then they could transition, if they qualified, into special education services. So IDEA and Part C really emphasizes natural environments. So what this means is you don't have to go to the doctor's office to get through your therapy or whatever. It's like you can have that in a natural setting. It could be incorporated into your preschool setting or childcare setting. It could be coming into your home and your natural environment in the home, but it's really about supporting children in their natural environment. And then IDEA also has this concept of least restricted environment. And part of that is the first placement option is a regular classroom, just your mainstream classroom where you would go if you didn't have disabilities, is the regular classroom with support pushed in. So it isn't, you need support, therefore you have to go somewhere else. It's supposed to be regular classroom with support pushed in. Now, if that's not working, then you can look at some other placement options. But the assumption is that you should be in a regular classroom with support in that natural environment of the regular classroom alongside your peers. The ADA, again, ADA stands for Americans with Disability Act. So ADA and Section 504 together, they're about prohibiting discrimination based on disability. The ADA was modeled after civil rights legislation that identified other groups of people. And this one is specifically around disability. So they're not allowed to discriminate. And again, there's this part called Title II. So this is the same thing with its city government. It's schools, it's any local, any state government. They can't discriminate just because you have a disability. In Section 504, they have this language around unequal education opportunities in the most integrated settings. So again, there's this legal concept of integration, not just separate and equal. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking equal access with integration. That's where you start. And then the ADA also has, and this is, I love this phrase, it's my favorite phrase, an equal opportunity to benefit. So not just like, yeah, here it is, see if you can learn how to, here's a manual, see if you can read it, see if you can benefit. It's an equal opportunity to benefit. So that goes back to that, one of the first slides I said that public schools have to work for everyone. We should all have an equal opportunity to benefit if we have a disability. So the schools should be designed and resourced so that everyone can benefit, including students with disabilities. So now I'm going to go back a little bit. We're going to do a little bit of a history lesson. And I'm going to do this because I think it's really important to understand because we have our laws, but then what we also see is sometimes the laws don't seem to be applied. And my theory is that we still have some lingering effects on the way things were before the 1970s. So before some foundational learning, children with disabilities did not have a right to go to school. Schools could, and they did, refuse to serve students. And what they would do is they would assess them. And they would decide, are you educable? And that's an ability to learn academics. Like, do we think you can even learn to read or write? If we don't, then no. If yes, then sure, then maybe you can come in. Are they trainable? So could they be trained? And they did use this language. Could they be trained to do specific things? Like maybe they can sort things on an assembly line or do laundry, or they could do something practical and they could be trained, something manual. And if that was the case, then maybe they would go into some sort of skill training center. And then they had custodial, and that was okay. We don't think we don't think you can learn to read or write or any of that good stuff. We don't really see how you can be trained to do anything, and so we think the best place for you would be an institution or facility where you could have long-term care. They would take care of you, but you're not going to get any sort of like skills that help you learn, skills that help you get a job. It's more long-term care. And these buckets were tied to IQ scores. That's an intelligent test. So they were tied to IQ scores. And there were some assumptions and bias about ability. And many children were excluded from education on the basis of disability. Now, you started seeing some shifts in the 1960s, and then it built from there. So you started seeing some court cases that were challenging exclusion. These were like here and there all over the United States, but you started seeing that. They're saying, wait, why are you excluding them? And then you started to see some changes in state law. In civil rights, there were those three federal laws that affirmed disability access. So we had the first one was Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act, and then came what we call now IDEA, but it had a different name then. It had the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and then you had the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. So about over the course of 30 years, you started to see this shift. And now we have a good foundation for inclusion. But how many of you, well, maybe you're a young group. I was born in 1965. And so when I started school, children were still excluded. And I don't remember having classes with kids with disabilities. I don't even remember seeing kids with physical disabilities or more pronounced disabilities throughout my whole education. I'm sure they were there, but they weren't. I don't even remember seeing like a trailer like in the playground where a segregated classroom. I honestly do not know where children with disabilities were educated in my school district when I was growing up, because they were not around. So then starting in the 70s, you started seeing this shift. And it went into the 90s. So I want to talk a little bit about this Section 504. And again, I'm just using that's the short term. The whole thing is the Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So Section 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. They have some similarities, but there's a little bit of difference. The Rehabilitation Act, and this one, the US government said you can't discriminate based on disability. It introduced the term free and appropriate public education. And for those of you who are already a part of the special education system, you might have heard of FAPE. That's what it stands for, free and appropriate. It's defined in the IDEA, but it is also defined before we had that law. It was defined through Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And then also it applies when programs get federal funding. And so schools get federal funding. A lot of states get federal funding for something specific. Even a lot of private places get federal funding for something specific. So this had a big reach, but it had to have federal funding. And we'll go into a little bit later, but there also, you had to comply with this. But if you were a public entity, you had a higher bar. If you were private and you just got a grant, you still had to comply with it, but you had a different standard, and it was a lesser standard. But anyways, if you were getting federal money, then you had to do this. And they had these concepts of you can't discriminate based on disability. And this is where they first introduced this concept of free and appropriate public education. And so 20 years later, we have the Americans with Disability Act. And so this expanded this. This built on this Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And it applied to both public and private settings, though not religious ones. I don't know why. That's how the law is written and passed. So private, but not religious settings. For people who might be involved in a preschool program, an example of this is if a church has a basement and they rent it out or they make it available free of charge for a childcare program or for a preschool to run, but the church doesn't run it, they just make it available to to another organization, then that's not considered a religious program, and that whoever's running that program would need to comply with the ADA. But if that were a religious school and that were a religious-based preschool, and it was run by the church, then they do not have to comply with the ADA. But the ADA was really a broad civil rights bill. And again, this applies to all aspects, employment, transportation. I mean, the ADA is why now when buses pull in, you might see them, sometimes they tilt down. Someone with the wheelchair can get on. That's the ADA. Paratransit, so that maybe somebody can't use the regular bus system, and so they have smaller buses that come and pick you up doorstep. That's the ADA. So it's way bigger than transportation. And so together, the ADA and Section 504 prohibit discrimination based on disability. Federal regulations require funding recipients to provide equal educational opportunities, again, there's that word opportunity, for children with disabilities in the most integrated setting appropriate. And again, that's that word appropriate. Like, what does appropriate mean? And again, that can be subjective. But if you go back to the research, if you know your research and you know what we know about how kids work, how the brain develops, what kids need to thrive, I think you can make a very strong argument for inclusion for the appropriate. And we know that the law already says, look, it's supposed to be integrated. That's where you start. So a little bit more information about Section 504 and the ADA. So together, it means that public schools, they cannot discriminate just because someone has a disability. They need to be able to get equal access and opportunity to benefit. It also means most public programs, all publicly funded but privately run programs like Head Start and ECAP, and all publicly run programs like a school district or city run, it applies to all of those. And none of those can discriminate based on disability. They cannot deny access because a child is disabled. They cannot require children with disabilities to enroll in a segregated class, school, or program. So they can't just sort of say, you have cerebral palsy, you have to be over here. They can't start with that. That's not what they're supposed to do. The premise is integration, and the premise is supports come to that child and serves the child in that setting. So I'm going to pause here and Okay, there are some things in the chat, but it's more about introduction. I want to pause here and just check in to see if anyone has any questions yet about this concept of Section 504 and the ADA. Okay, if you do, just go ahead and put in the chat, and then when I next pause, I'll go back and I'll answer them. So the reason why I talk about this is a lot of people, they get in their introduction to school, especially if you were somebody who was in the early supports, so that Part C, if you had the 0 to 3 services, and then you went into, preschool special education services, you might only know this concept of special education, and you might only know then the special education rules and IDEA, and it's important to understand that. But you need to know that there's other foundational law that even if your child wasn't getting special education services, they would still be covered by this other law. So that's main thing I really want to make sure people understand, that there's this other foundational law. So IDEA is not the only protection. It was originally passed in the early mid-70s as the Education for All Handicapped Children. It was later named Individuals with Education Act, or IDEA. And it only applies to certain students, I'm sorry, to students with certain types of disabilities. And so you have to have one of the covered disabilities, and you need to require individualized instruction. So we have students with disabilities who are not covered by IDA because either they have a disability that's not covered, or they don't need individualized instruction. Maybe they need an accommodation, and they still have a right to education, and they still have certain rights about what the school can do around accommodations and modifications, but they don't need individualized instruction. But it's not the only protection. If a child does not qualify for IDA, or sometimes parents decline special education services, those other ones still apply. Section 504 and the ADA still apply. Section 504 also has this concept of free and appropriate public education. So I'm not encouraging anyone to deny special education services. I think those are very, very important. But if for some reason you didn't have special education services, your student would still have a right to free and appropriate public education. If the child qualifies for IDEA and uses special education services, these other bills still apply. It's not like, oh, I'm doing one and therefore I lose my access to this. Altogether, it all applies. And so IDEA has these concepts. It's bigger than this, but this is what I'm going to focus on today. It has the concept of least restricted environment, individualized education programs, and parents as part of the decision making. So parents are part of that IEP team. And some big takeaways I want you to have today are: there is anti-discrimination law to protect students from bias. That's part of that. I don't know if anyone's heard of this concept of protected class. Sometimes they'll define it, religion, gender, racial, ethnic. There's different groups of people, and they're considered a protected class because usually what happens is there's evidence of discrimination, so they get written into law saying we want to make sure people aren't discriminated against, so we're going to give them a protected class, which basically means more vigilant watching to make sure that their rights aren't infringed on. And disability is one of those protected classes. And believe it or not everyone knows this. Not everyone in school systems, not all the educators necessarily know this, which is kind of mind-boggling, but there we go. But disability is a protected class. It's also important to note that the law favors a natural setting and that services are supposed to travel to the child. So this comes into place in inclusion in the sense of like, can that service be folded into the general education? If they need individualized instruction, how can that happen in just the general classroom setting? The presumed setting is the one the children would be in if they did not have a disability. And there needs to be a reason, and it needs to be backed up by something like data, the law, research needs to be backed up to remove them. So they can't just kind of say, well, what if they go over here? There has to be a reason to be removed from the environment. And it can't be, well, we don't really have the funding to do that. It can't be, well, this is what we really prefer to do, because they have a right to be in an inclusive setting. So if they're taken out of that into integrated setting, if they're taken out of that inclusive setting, what is the rationale for that? What is the research basis for that? What is the legal foundation basis for that? And in special education, we don't get into it in this presentation, but they collect data about how the child is doing, information, and that's also really information. So if they're not thriving in a separate setting, then that could be information too. Well, then maybe we need different supports, and maybe we can also show that they're not really doing well in that environment. They should be perhaps doing better in another environment. And again, in the class, part one of this two-part sequence, part one kind of gets into the research, and it does show that students actually do a lot better in integrated and inclusive settings than they do in segregated settings. So, presumed setting, regular place, supports pushed in. The individual education program, or IEP, are person-centered. So they're designed for what the person needs. Again, not what is convenient for the school, but what the child needs, what the student needs. And again, it's about making sure that the education is accessible. So anything that the school district is offering, the child with the disabilities need to have equal opportunity, need to have equal access, and then they need to have an equal opportunity to benefit. IDEA, special education, helps makes that happen. And parents have an important role. The team, again, I said this before, but it is not just the school staff. You're part of that team. And it's written that way because you have a lot of insight, especially like you can see, like, are they thriving? Do they have questions? Like, what's happening with them? What are they responding to? So parents are a key part of that team. They may not always feel like it, but they're a key part. Okay. So now again, a little bit of this history lesson for disability rights in public education. So one of the first things that kicked off this whole concept of inclusion was that key case. It had nothing to do with disability, but it challenged this concept of segregated settings. And that was 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. And that was about segregation is illegal. And that one was very much on a racial bias, and specifically Black African-American children. There were segregated schools. They were sent to segregated schools. You had this federal ruling, a Supreme Court ruling that said, segregation is illegal. And so that started opening up the board. So then in the 1960s, this was not a disability legislation, but this was something big going on. What was called then the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This has had different definitions. It's been reauthorized and renamed through the years. At one point, it was No Child Left Behind. Now it's called the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And part of this in 65, it included this concept of funding for children with handicaps. So this predates special education services. So even in the 60s, they could still deny them access to public education. But we started seeing this legal thinking of, you started seeing this appropriations of, maybe we should be paying for education, mid-60s. So in the early 70s, you started seeing these legal cases come up that challenged this concept of denying children an education or requiring that they be segregated. And so a couple cases there were this PRC Park and Mills case. So that was in the early 70s. In 1973, that's when we had this Rehabilitation Act, and you had the Section 504. And by the way, Section 504, it took a couple years to get that in place. There was a lot of civic engagement. There was a lot of rallying, a lot of political pressure, a lot of sit-ins. There's a lot of mass mobilization that had to happen for them to actually implement the law. But they did. They did finally write the rules. They did implement the law. In 1975 is when you have what we now know as the IDEA. Again, it was called Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Later, it was renewed, and the name was changed to Individuals with Disability Act. Part C, those early supports for infants and toddlers, that came on in the mid to late 80s. The last update was in 2004. And when the 2004 came in with that authorization, they added, the law has changed over the years. And they added this concept of a form for an individual education program. So there needs to be a form that people follow. Right now, our state is actually working on a statewide IEP platform to help make that easier for people to use. But you have this concept of like there needs to be a form in 2004. Notice for parents of what their rights are and what the procedural safeguards are. That came out in 2004. And this concept of prior written notice, which is just another way of saying, hey, you need to let me know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that's important because of the rationale. Why are you doing that? Because then you have to be able to show, well, is it appropriate? I mean, is it supported by data? Is it supported by research? Is it aligned with the law? Because if you don't agree with prior written notice, then that can help be your basis of how you respond to that. And maybe you have a different idea. So some legal specifics. Actually, before I get into this, does anyone have a question at this point? You can either speak up if you want, or you can put them into the chat. But are we okay so far? All right, awesome. Okay, some legal specifics. You're all going to be able to say Section 504, equal opportunity to benefit. Civil rights law focus on anti-discrimination and access. This is Section 504 in the ADA. They use a broader definition of disability than IDEA. Their definition is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity or body function. So basically just any kind of disability, you have a right, you're covered. You're covered in schools, you're covered in other parts of public life. It prohibits any entity that receives federal financial assistance from discriminating on the basis of disability. And again, bigger than schools, but schools, public schools, all public, many private preschools and childcare centers, again, unless they are run by a religious organization, they also need to comply. If they receive federal funds, then 504 applies. In public settings, there's this bar of a free and appropriate public education with an equal opportunity to participate and benefit. And again, that word integrated, in the most integrated setting. Auxiliary aids were necessary. And then private schools, there's a little different standard for private schools. So they still have to comply. So if they get some sort of federal grant to run a program, they still need to comply with the law, but there's a different standard. So they do not have to substantially modify their program. So they don't have to completely rework it to accommodate somebody with a disability, but they do need to make minor adjustments to accommodate access. So you get the most protection in a public program, but you do get some protection in a private program. This is just under 504. And again, that free and appropriate public education, that's part of Section 504, as well as IDEA. And they define it a little differently. They use slightly different words, but it's the same concept. Provision of regular or special education and related aids and services are designed to meet the student's individual education needs as adequately as the needs of non-disabled students are met. So again, there's this concept of equity, parity, like you need to make the schools work for the kids with disabilities. Again, that opening slide was all public schools need to work for all students. This is sort of the legal foundation where that statement is rooted in. Inclusion under Section 504. Also, we get into placed in the same setting to the maximum extent appropriate for the education needs of students with disabilities. So again, we have, various points in ADA, Section 504, as well as IDEA, this concept of they're in the mainstream setting with support there, maximum appropriate. And again, appropriate can be subjective, but that's where the data collection comes in. That's where the research of what we know, where children thrive and don't thrive, what are their learning needs. That all comes into play there. The recipient of federal funds must place a student with a disability in a regular education environment. I know I'm repeating, but I'm repeating because that's what the law says again and again and again. And it's important because this is the kind of thing where if you're in a situation where they're saying, what do you mean they can't possibly be in this class? You do have a really strong legal foundation to lean into. So the law says Section 504, a regular education environment, unless it's demonstrated that the student's need cannot be met satisfactorily with the use of aids and services. So again, it's not, yeah, you can be there okay as long as you can keep up, but if you need something special, then we have to go over here. That's not what the law says. The law says we get aids and services there. And again, there may be some situations where it's still not going to work out. You still then need to think about something else, and you still have rights about something else. But that's really where we start this conversation. The conversation starts about, let's make sure that general education is accessible to students with disabilities. And if you qualify for certain services, you can get some accommodations, and we'll make some changes to make sure it's accessible. Students with disability participate with non-disabled students in both academic and non-academic services. This includes meals, recess, physical education, again, to the maximum extent. So it's not just, oh, they can have lunch together. It's no, academic and non-academic, or it's not like, oh, they have a disability, so they can't be in choral or whatever. It's all together with supports if needed. The Americans with Disability Act, again, this was passed in 1990. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability by any public entity. It's a federal law, so it applies to federal entities. We have Title II, which is state and local entities, and that includes the school district. And they have to do it regardless of funding. This is just basic. Like it's public, it needs to be accessible to people with disabilities. Title II, as I said, is the public entities. Title III, that's the one that a lot of people think of in terms of like, do you need to have a ramp to your local business or something like that? So that's a place of public accommodation. That can include private schools, private preschools, a family-based childcare. And again, religious entities are exempt from ADA regulations. You have different Title II, because it's public. There's just, again, it's as a general rule, if it's a public setting, you're always going to have more rights. Title III, they can't deny you, but they also they have a lower bar of like sort of minor modifications. Like they don't have to fundamentally redo their program if it's a private program, but that you do still have some protections. And then obligations. Most integrated setting, see that word again. And they cannot exclude except in the case of direct threat to health and safety. And then integrated settings, they define that, are ones that provide individuals with disabilities opportunities to live and receive services in the greater community like individuals without disabilities. And they must offer reasonable accommodations. Title II again. They prohibit discrimination by public entities. They protect children with disabilities from unlawful discrimination in programs, activities, and services operated by state or local government, and that includes the school district. It provides that no qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of such disability, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of such services, programs, or activities if a public entity or be subject to discrimination by such entity. And that's not plain language, sorry, but that's just the legal language. But I just wanted to let you know what the words actually say. And I bolded ones that I thought were important to flag. And really getting into that excluded from participation or denied the benefits. And that's where we get equal access, and that's where we get equal opportunity to benefit from. So your school district may be offering special education services, but if they're really making them only available in a restricted setting, I think you can call the question of, are they really embracing the ADA? It's a different type of law. So Title II applies to services and programs, all. I already did that. Yeah, inclusion under ADA. So that's 504 and ADA. I'm going to go into IDA. Are there any questions about 504 and the ADA? I think we're good. All right. So let's go to ADA. I'm sorry, IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act. So it started out as the Education for All and handicapped children. Sorry, Education for All handicapped children, not all children. 1975. They had a goal, was to provide students with disabilities the same opportunity for education as children without disabilities. Again, you get that equity and that equal, you've got that concept. And the rationale was to be able to access education. Some students are going to need some supports and specialized instruction. So the foundational 504 ADA, everyone has a right to be here. We need to provide equal access. Well, how do you make that happen? That's where this legislation comes in. This is sort of like the way to make that accessible to students. In addition to a free and appropriate public education, this is where you have the concept of a least restricted environment, also called LRE, and students get that individualized education program. The individualized education program will include placement, so that will define what services they get and where those services will happen. Parents, part of the IEP team, this is written into the law. So you're there, you're equal members of the team, may not feel like it, but you're equal members of the team. And that's because you have insight, valuable insight to offer. The school's not supposed to develop an IEP without you. They're not supposed to do predetermination. Now, they might have some drafts and they share the drafts and there's some back and forth, but it shouldn't be a done deal, signed up, and we're not going to talk about it anymore. It's not the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to be part of the development of this document. And they can't change placement without giving you a chance to challenge it. So if they're in the general education setting and they said, we don't think it's working, we're going to move them over into this sort of program instead, you need to have an opportunity to challenge that and ask them, well, why do you think that? And the same is also true if they were in a self-contained or a separate setting and you liked that and thought the kid was really, your student, your child was really thriving in that one and they wanted to move them, same thing. You have a chance to challenge that and ask why. Why are you doing this? What's your rationale for it? They need to be able to defend it and you should be able to understand it and respond to it. The how of access. So child find, hopefully you know about child find, but they're supposed to, under this legislation, school districts are supposed to find children and work with parents to design appropriate services so they can access education. The early intervention services were started in the late 80s, and those are your infants and toddlers. So there's this concept of like, the community needs to be able to identify children who might need services and assess whether or not they need services. Child find is specific to school districts. And that's where, again, they have to locate, identify, and evaluate whether they need services. And this is from birth to 21. And there's no need to fail first. That's another key part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is child find. Support from the start. So again, it has this concept of 0 up to age 3 early interventions. A lot of those are more like family education or therapies. It's more about making sure kids are getting support developing the skills that aren't actually developing. And it can be a very physical thing. It could be something different, but it's basically habilitative just to help them build up their skills so they can thrive. Part C, that's the part for infants and toddlers. Part B, that's your preschool from 3 to 5, and then your K-12 from ages 5 to 21. And again, the concept of FAPE means free and appropriate public education. Again, what's appropriate? That's why you need to know your research and why you need your data collection as well as law. And then LRE, least restricted environment. So this is the section that talks specifically about what is LRE. To the maximum extent, appropriate. Children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are non-disabled. So again, this is getting into that concept of integration, a setting where everyone is supported and they're there with non-disabled peers to the maximum extent. Special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education and regular classes, even with use of supplemental aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So sometimes people need to do something different for certain students. They need a different type of support. It's not working out. This is a flexible piece of legislation. They want to make it so that we can do what's appropriate for the child. But because it can be flexible, that isn't a rationale then to automatically remove children from that setting. There needs to be a rationale for it. You needs to be like, well, what are they doing? And it can't just be, well, they need individualized instruction and therefore they need to be somewhere else. Individualized instruction can be provided in the general education setting. A lot of services can be pushed into the general education setting, or they can be provided in a way that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be entirely removed. Like, for instance, maybe they meet for some specific therapy services like speech language that they don't necessarily do it with class. Maybe they do some one-on-one, but that doesn't mean they can't still be part of their class for the rest of the day. So with least restricted environment, the first placement option, again, always the regular classroom. That's where you start. The full range of aids and services to support and modifications do not require separation. The IEP team, and you're part of that, you might end up there somewhere else. But you really start thinking, okay, well, how are we going to support them in the general education setting? Continuum of options must be available. So they should allow participation with peers in the general education curriculum and non-academic activities to the maximum extent appropriate. Sometimes I get questions about, like, what about after school activities, things like that. If it's a school program, like a school sports team, et cetera, things like that. If it's a school run program, then this applies. If it's just happens to be, it's provided by another organization, it just happens to be provided on school grounds after school hours, that's something different. But your school activities, so, choir, drama, sports activities, things like that, to the maximum extent appropriate, this concept of integration applies. So here's where there's a difference of opinion. And it's a pretty strong difference of opinion on the basis of attorneys who feel this way. But this is something I've noticed. I'm not an attorney, so I can't speak to the legalities of it. But this is something I have noticed. So the language is really clear about a child's not removed from education solely because they need modifications. The law is pretty clear about that. And there's this concept of what is LRE. So sometimes, like on a school district website or even a state website, they might say, well, least restricted environment, that's whatever's appropriate for the child. Whatever is appropriate for the child is the least restricted environment. Attorneys who work in this, attorneys who work with families and students, not for the school districts, they say no. There is a legal definition of LRE, and it's not fluid. What a least restricted environment is, it is the general education classroom with individualized instruction and related services, whatever the child needs. That's what LRE is. LRE is you get your services and you're in the environment that's least restricted, and that's least restricted. And it's a legal concept and it's fixed in law. That's what many attorneys will say. If that placement doesn't work, the IEP team needs to consider an alternative placement. This is true, but that doesn't make it, well, then this is your LRE. The LRE is still that general education setting with services and support put in. Alternative placement is really something that's needed for free and appropriate public education. Yes, they have a right to an alternative setting, and you might want to pursue that, but that's not what LRE is. Again, there's a difference in legal opinion here. Districts might argue otherwise, but the attorneys for children and families are pretty adamant that no, LRE is fixed. And again, I can't give legal counsel on that. That's an observation that I have. And again, it's this concept of special education or services and not a place. And by the way, our state went through and they actually changed, and kudos, I don't know how much difference it makes on the ground, but they actually went through and they redid all the Washington Administrative Code and references in RCW. They want to make sure that it doesn't just say special education, that says special education services. And they're doing that because they're trying to emphasize, again, it's not a place. If you go back when I was talking about the history lesson, when people would sort of like assess them, like, are you educable? Are you trainable? Are you custodial? It's like, that's not our legal framework anymore. We still have that. People still operate under that assumption to some extent. We still see, bits and parts of that influencing the system, but it's not supposed to be that way. These are services. Services can be provided in a number of settings, and we're supposed to we try to make sure that these services are working in the general education setting. So students are learning alongside their peers without disabilities. And so the primary purpose of special education is to support them in the general education setting. It's to support them so they get access to this different curriculum. And they're supposed to supplement, not supplant. So it's not just your IEP. The IEP helps inform all of your learning. You're supposed to have a comprehensive education. Your education is not just whatever services are in the IEP. The IEP is about making sure that you have access to a comprehensive education. And it's a legal document. It has to follow the rules of IDEA. It spells out the services, supports, and settings. So yes, if it's in the IEP, then they are supposed to implement it. So this Oberti versus Board of Education was a ruling in 1992. And I like this one because it really asserts that inclusion is a right, not a privilege. A child shouldn't have to earn his way into an integrated school setting by first functioning successfully in a segregated setting. Inclusion is a right and not a privilege. And again, that's based on this concept of 504, ADA, IDA. They're all consistent. They all say an integrated setting, and they all say with services in that setting, that's where you start out. So that's what gives it the right. As somebody will point it out, and I'll agree, the way our court systems are set up, that you've got binding and you've got influence. So, and this was not a Supreme Court opinion, this was a circuit court. So in the region of the third, which is like this particular region was like Pennsylvania East, kind of like Central East coast. So this is binding in that circuit court. But the other courts, it's influential for other courts. So other courts, if another similar case comes before it, and it's been standing now since the 90s. It hasn't, the Supreme Court didn't have to rule on this. It wasn't contested or they didn't pick it up. So it's not necessarily binding in our circuit, but it's still it's influencing the rulings in our circuit, and it's still considered sort of foundational interpretation. This is how other courts and judges have interpreted it. It hasn't been challenged. So again, inclusion is a right, it's not a privilege. And this is important because sometimes you'll hear, well, let's see how they do here. If they do here, then maybe we can think about moving them over there. And again, that's just not what the law says. So I want to talk a little bit about special education services in preschool. And the main thing to know is, yeah, they also have to offer least restricted environment. And again, it's that concept of least restricted environment is a general education setting with supports, not a separate school, not a segregated program. And they have to offer that least restricted environment, whether or not they offer another type of preschool. So for instance, some school districts don't run a preschool for kids without disabilities. They only have something that we call in Washington developmental preschool. So it's only something that's offered to children with disabilities. But even if that's their only program, they still have to figure out a way to offer least restricted environment. So theoretically, they could be pushing in their services maybe to a Head Start program or to an ECAP program, or even it could be at any sort of community preschool. But just because you don't offer a preschool program doesn't mean that they don't have the right to have their education in a general education setting. And in preschool, that's defined as 50-50. So, so some developmental preschools say there's 12 kids and 2 do not have disabilities. That's not considered a general education program. That's still considered a separate or a segregated program, or they call them here developmental, I don't know. If they have, say it was 12 kids and 6 had disabilities and 6 did not, then that would meet the definition. The 50% doesn't really come into play in K-12 because The minority of children have disability, majority have. So if you're in a general education setting, you automatically have the 50%. But we do see this in the preschool settings. So I know somebody on here, supported families, it's like, if the school district is only offering a developmental program and they're not offering something where they have access, technically they need to offer something with full access. They are still upheld to least restricted environment. And so that's where you're starting to see more school districts under pressure. You're starting to see them create maybe their braiding programs in, so maybe they have some funding. There's separate funding, has nothing to do with special education services, but it's called Title I funding. It has to do with maybe poverty, so they get extra funds, and some school districts get something called learning assistance program funding, and that's, again, it's usually tied to poverty levels, but it can also just be kids who just need extra instruction. They'll pull and they'll braid these different funding sources, and so then they'll provide a preschool program for children with and without disabilities. And so you'll start to see more of that. And some of our school districts, there's a slide in here, they do all the kids together, everything is inclusive, and some are very segregated. It's kind of all over the place. But we're doing slightly better, not a whole lot better. We're doing a tiny bit better than we were a few years ago. We did get our WACs updated to a WAC is a Washington Administrative Code. The law, you have a revised Code of Washington. When the legislature passes a law, it's called an RCW. And then your agencies, your government agencies, they interpret that law and say, well, they apply rules. Like, this is what it means. This is what it means for you when you run your programs. And those are called WACs, or Washington Administrative Code. And so it's probably been 2 or 3 years now, and it was a multi-year effort. We got the special education WACs updated. We being, there was a group of advocates from across the state. We got the WACs updated, and a key part of that was we made sure that it was very, very clear for preschool services that school districts, you need to be offering special education preschool services in a general education setting. It is not okay to require them to be in a separate setting. They should be learning alongside peers without disabilities. They need that. So in other words, you need to change your program to comply with the law. And there was a lot of pushback from school districts, but the law was the law. And so now you're starting to see some transition to kindergarten. You're starting to see a few more programs that are incorporating their braiding funds. And so they're making preschool for students with disabilities and without disabilities, and they're able to create that general education setting. So what are your community options for preschool services if you have a child with a disability? So it could be some of the development, they might call it a developmental program, but they are integrated. So it could be an integrated developmental preschool program. It could be, they have something now called a transition to kindergarten program. I'm in Seattle. We don't have this in Seattle, to my knowledge, but some school districts are starting these programs. It's basically, I don't know why they don't just call it preschool. They call it transition to kindergarten, but it's the same sort of concept of we want to make sure there's some kids that need a little bit extra help to be ready for kindergarten, so they have these programs. ECAP, that's our state's state-funded preschool program. It stands for Early Childhood Education Assistance Program. That has that. And by the way, if your child has a disability, has an IEP, they automatically qualify for ECAP. There may or may not be a place. It's one of these things where you qualify, but it doesn't necessarily give you a right to a slot. It's really depending on funding and whether there's anything available. But you are eligible for an ECAP. Head Start is a similar program. That's a federal program. For Head Start, you need to have a certain income cap. So you do need to be low income to qualify for Head Start. But ECAP, if you have that IEP, so if you're transitioning out of, say, 0 to 3 services, your child is automatically eligible for ECAP if they want that. You may not want that placement, you may want something else, but you are eligible for ECAP. And I emphasize this because there was a lot of confusion. And again, this was something that even the state's website made it sound like you had to have low income to qualify for ECAP. And for most people you do, but disability qualifies you for it. So I just want to let you know about that. So a lot of times it's a Head Start ECAP program, or a transition to kindergarten program, or an integrated developmental preschool program. But if there isn't anything, then your school district needs to figure out how to make it happen. And it could be you just are in your regular childcare setting and they push in services. And some families, what they'll do is they will just do whatever childcare works for them, whatever preschool program works for them, and they'll just travel to their, if they have a specific therapy or something that they're using, they'll just do that separately because they want that integrated program, or a lot of times it just has to do with what works best for childcare for them. So special education state law, if you did not know, our law for special education predates the federal law. From 1971, we passed our law, and that says all children with disabilities shall have the opportunity for an appropriate education at public expense as guaranteed to them by the Constitution and applicable federal laws. So it's a state right as well as a federal right. Special education services are a part of what's called the state's program of basic education. And that is basically our state, you have public education. Within public education, there's basic education is what every student has a right to. And it's defined in statute, and it comes through court cases because our state's kind of unique in that we require the state to be the primary funding source for school districts. And so through the years, there's like, well, what does that mean? What do they have to provide? And they came in with this, the court came with this concept of they need to provide a basic education. Like you can define what basic education is, but it needs to be, but you need to pay for basic education. So the legislature defined and they've refined the definition. They've changed that through the years, but there is a program of basic education. Part of that includes special education services, and students with disabilities should have complete access to the basic education. And that includes things like reading and math and all the normal things. Part of a definition of basic education, part of the definition of basic education is also the opportunity to complete the 24 credits for high school. So it also means, yeah, they should have the opportunity to do all the classes that students without disabilities have. Might look a little different, might be defined a little different, there might be some modifications, but they have a right. That's part of the program of basic education. And yes, students with disabilities still have a right to the program. And so then individualized education program is going to determine placement. And I'll stop here and just check in if anyone has any questions.
I mean, I don't know, maybe a question, maybe a comment. I was going to say, I mean, I've found that a big barrier with developmental preschools is the fact that it's typically 4 days a week, 2.5 hours a day. And a lot of school and transport districts don't necessarily have transportation. So for a lot of working families, it's just not feasible for their child to participate. I mean, and sometimes they'll choose an ECAP or a Head Start program that may have less accommodations or less skill building for the child, but because it's all day, it's feasible. Or they'll try to find a daycare, which again, maybe not the ideal solution for the child's educational needs, but solves the child care problem.
Yeah, yeah, it's a complicated one. But legally and theoretically, services could be pushed into that childcare setting. So we could have a different model. Instead of like everyone travels to this program, we could have, I guess they call it itinerant. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but basically, travel and push in. The services still need to be designed by a special education educator, but they can be, used. We could do more closely connecting special education departments with ECAP and Head Start and community preschools. But we'll see how that evolves. But yeah, thank you for that comment. I really appreciate it. So transitioning to preschool, in your 0 to 3 years, you have something called an individualized family service plan. Excuse me, and that centers the child and the family, which is nice. I wish they had that in the Part B, but they don't. But you have this nice, it's got a family service plan. We're going to support the family. We're going to center the family and the child because the two come together. They don't suddenly separate, by the way, when they turn 3 or 8 or 12 or 28. They're still together, but legally, you get this family plan in the 0 to 3 years. and includes early intervention services and supports, supposed to be in that natural environment. Things change, and when you transition into preschool, again, that starts at age 21. And that's, you have to qualify for that. So just because you're in the early support program doesn't necessarily mean you will qualify for services later. Many do, but some don't. So that's when you get what's called an individualized education program. And that's not about the family. The family gets to be part of the IEP team, but that is about the child and their educational needs. And it also kind of shifts. It's like with the individual, in the 0 to 3 years, there's more of a, therapies, and there's more of an integrated health and well-being component. And then you go into the IEP system, you go into, the ages 3 to 21, and it's about accessing education. Again, that's what this law was about, is about accessing education. And it includes special education or individualized instruction, as well as related services, modifications, and supports. And then the IEP, again, is supposed to be a team approach. It's a blueprint for the teaching and supporting the student. It's going to lay out what sort of specialized instruction is happening, what sort of supports are supposed to be happening, what sort of services, related services, and that can include a lot of things. It can include things like training for staff so they can support the student. It can include transportation, to and from home or from their daycare. It can also include things like therapy. So it can include a lot of different things, but all that is spelled out in the IEP, and it needs, again, it's supposed to be about making sure the student has access then to the general education. And then it also says in the IEP, the placement, again, so the placement is these services, and then like physically where that's going to happen. And again, the law talks about, well, let's start with the integrated setting with the supports there. You don't have to, the law says that that's where you first have to consider. It doesn't necessarily mean the student must be placed there and then they can only leave that when they fail. But it does mean that's where the IEP team starts the discussion. The discussion is the assumption of a general education setting. What do we need to provide in that setting for them to succeed? So the IEP team is going to create, and then the parent or guardian is an important member. And then later on, actually, anytime from the get-go, that the student is also part of the IEP team. But if they're really young, realistically, I don't know how much they would participate. But later on, some students can, and they certainly do, participate in their IEP process. So they're also a part of the team. And again, it's a legal document. So you often hear like getting the IEP, and that's because it's legal. There's what's in there, they are supposed to implement it. And then I mentioned this earlier, but there are things like training staff. That's really important. Like maybe there's something specific about your student. It can include things like behavior support as well. It's like training staff so they know how to work with the particular student. And then the IEP is supposed to drive placement, not the other way around. So it's not like, well, we have this program over here for autistic kids, say, and so we're going to write the IEP so this program works for them. It's supposed to be no, these are supposed to be individualized services. And it's also all this education, it's supposed to be linked to standards. So you really want to make sure you understand what the state standards are, so you understand what general education entails. And that kind of depends on what world you live in special education. Some people live in a world of special education. I have my older child uh, got speech therapy services when he was in elementary school. So he was a special education services, but he was entirely like, he was in class. The only thing is he got pulled out a couple hours a week for his, speech language work, with which small group with a therapist. Otherwise, he was entirely in it. And so some people for special education, this is their world. It's like they're mainstream and they just get some specific services or some specific individualized instruction, maybe around learning disability support, but they're in this setting. But other families and families that we work with through the ARC with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they don't really have access to that world. They tend to be put first in a very, very segregated, where children really don't get access much to that world. And that's what we're trying to break down. But you shouldn't know. So if you're in that isolated world, maybe you don't know what all the learning standards are. Maybe you don't know what's going on, but your child does have a right to that. So I really encourage people to just know what basic education is, know what general education is, because that's what you're supposed to be having access to. And there's academic, there's also social, emotional, and academic learning altogether. So there's different types of learning standards out there. And again, and in later years, I mentioned there's the opportunity for 24 credits. So it does include the opportunity to earn a high school diploma. There is the regular diploma and there is a different diploma, but you should have the opportunity to try to earn whatever diploma is what your child wants, is what they need. Again, appropriate, it's unfortunately a subjective term. But that's where I say it's like, well, what are they basing this decision on? What information have they gathered? Where your child is thriving? What does the research say? We do know that the research really firmly supports inclusive placement, integrated placement. Generally, IEP teams should create challenging and ambitious expectations and goals. So again, what's challenging, what's ambitious. So these are the kinds of things that get defined, that they're get written into law, and maybe you have some rules and then somebody contests it at some point and you have a lawsuit, and then finally like, the Supreme Court will weigh in. And so what we had for years, some educational benefit, which is nice. It's kind of sad that they had to like actually get that, 10 years after the law, almost they had to like say, well, you need some educational benefit. And then a little bit more recently, about where were we? 7 years ago? 8 years ago? So more recently in 2017, we had the Andrew decision, and that's appropriately ambitious. So it's a little bit better than some educational. We're getting better, but again, these are the kind of logistics that you constantly, the law has constantly been pushed. It's kind of like you got the basic law and they pushed to make it a better law. They pushed to get more protections. You had court rulings that basically said like, okay, you can't deny them an education entirely. To like, all right, you need to, make sure they get some education. There needs to be some educational benefit. And now we've moved into appropriately ambitious. So it's the legal adapts. It's adapted through the years, and it's adapted through the years because people are constantly pushing it to serve students better. So advocacy really matters. Um, and special education services, again, the whole point of the service is to give access to general education. So if your child is entirely excluded from general education, that is a huge red flag. Like what's going on? And that doesn't just mean it's general education, the setting of general education, but like the curriculum, what are they learning? They're supposed to have access to that. They have rights to that. They have state rights to that. They have federal rights to a basic education, a general education. They have access to the education that other children are learning, and they're supposed to be given an equal opportunity to benefit. Again, those are my favorite phrase, equal opportunity to benefit. I'm going to get a t-shirt that says equal opportunity to benefit. And then just a reminder, unfortunately, there is bias in the system. We've got a lot of people who, there's not as many, but we still have administrators and educators and legislators who, they predate, IDEA. They predate a lot of this legislation, and they still use terms like, is that child educable? And sometimes that can really influence them. It's not supposed to, and that's why it's important to know these concepts of, yeah, it's supposed to be integrated. And there's a lot more. On this one, we're talking about inclusion. So I really focus on least restricted environment because that is really the basis around an inclusive setting. And so that unfortunately there is a lot of bias. There's a lot of ableism in the system. And you're going to have to be able to navigate that while pushing it to change. And again, for people with younger kids is school districts for preschool, they still need to provide a free and appropriate public education. It starts at age 3. It's not just K through 12. In the least restricted environment, so those classes should be 50-50 minimum. If they aren't, then they should be making an opportunity for the child to be able to serve in a general education setting. And they're supposed to be serving all children with disabilities in the region. They're supposed to find them, and if they qualify under the certain categories and require individualized instruction, then they should be serving them. It's not like, well, we only have funding to serve this many. They're supposed to serve everyone. And this applies whether or not they have some sort of inclusive or integrated early learning program. Every child has a right to least restricted environment. The schools are supposed to change and adapt their programs to make sure that the education system is working for everyone. When you disagree, what are your options? Prior written notice. So that's basically saying, why are you making this decision? What's your rationality? And that's going to give you, a lot of information. Does it align with law and research, with the goals? Again, what information are they using? Because then when you know the rationale, you can respond. Maybe you'll agree, maybe you like adamantly disagree, but at least now you know like where they're coming from, what their thinking is, and you can respond to that. And you can respond to that with what you think is appropriate. You can request a meeting or administrative hearing to discuss concerns. It's an opportunity to speak with the district representative. And this is one where a lot of people feel like, well, if I'm being pushy, um, I'm not being a good player, I'm not being a team player, like sometimes an IEP team, like especially if it's a child who has more complex needs or needs a higher degree of support than a lot of the other kids using special education services, sometimes that IEP team, if they may not really feel that they have the authority to say yes this, yes that. When you bring in somebody else at a higher level, that can actually be a positive thing. But it is your right, and I do encourage people to exercise their rights. If needed, you can file a community complaint or a due process request. A due process is it's illegal. It's a formal way of contesting and saying, I don't think you should do that. I think you should do this. There's a court process. It's not a lawsuit, but it is a legal process. It is specific to that student. A community complaint is broader. That's like basically saying like, I don't think that you're following the law. Like for instance, I worked with somebody with a community complaint for a school district that didn't offer any general education setting for preschool. They only have developmental preschool. So we filed a community complaint, said, hey, you're not following the law. You're not giving any child, let alone this child, not giving any child the right to do this. You're not compliant with IDA. You're not compliant with the state WACs. You're not compliant. So that would be, we want a community complaint. And then usually what happens is that triggers an investigation. And then what typically happens is training is ordered for staff. And the investigation really, first of all, figures out like, well, did they not violate, did or did they not violate a law? And if they did, it's kind of like, all right, is this just like one person in this school? Is this the whole school? Is this the whole district? It's like a community complaint can really help make sure people understand what the law is and give them support to apply the law. So I like community complaints because I think it's important that people understand the law and they apply the law. You can request mediation. It's a less formal process, but you can request it. And then due process is one where that's a formal legal challenge. And then oversight, your school districts, your school board has the legal and, well, we won't get into morals. They are legally responsible for making sure the laws are applied. So they can't fob it off. Ultimately, it really is the school board has the authority here. That if they're violating the laws, you can appeal to the due process. You can file a community complaint with OSBI to come in to investigate where the school district's complying with the laws. But ultimately, it's the local governing board that has the responsibility. So that's where the legal responsibility lies at the local control. And they're the governing entity. And these are a little bit dated now, but I wanted to show this because the laws are the same, but how school districts apply them can really vary. Can vary locally, can vary, statewide, vary nationally. And that's where it's really important to know what the law is. And it is important for people who are able to advocate. Not everyone has the bandwidth. But so this is looking specifically at preschoolers with IEPs. And red is the Washington state, gray is the national average, and green is Colorado. And I selected Colorado because this particular year, they were the most inclusive for preschool. So a regular program supports, so the least restricted environment, where you're supposed to start, just your regular class, supports come to you. So 80% of students with disability, preschoolers with disabilities who qualify for IDEA. In Colorado, 87% are in a regular program, supports pushed in. In this year, Washington State only 25% was, and nationally it was 46. So we're definitely trailing the national average, but we're also really trailing what can be done. So that's what that one says. A regular program supports elsewhere. So you're in a regular preschool, but maybe you get pulled out for different supports, or maybe it's an all-day program and you spend 2 hours in developmental and then the rest of the day you're in an ECAP program or something like that. We're about the same with national. That particular year it was 25-25. But if you notice, Colorado doesn't do that. They just go with the push in. A separate class or school, so the developmental programs that are not integrated with at least 50-50. So again, 2 kids out of 10 wouldn't qualify, but if it was 5 and 5 or 6 and 6, it would. So that's where we have a lot more. We were more than the national this particular year. We still are a lot more than the national. So that you can see, that's what we're doing here in Washington. We're doing separate classes for preschoolers. Again, Colorado, that's not their model. They do push in. And then service provider location. So this could be like, as someone else said later, it's like sometimes these developmental programs, the hours, like 2 hours a day, what you're supposed to do with that. If you can't, if you're working full time, you can't arrange for a pickup. So some people will just, their children will be wherever, in whatever childcare setting, maybe you're homeschooling them, be whatever setting. But there are some specific services that you need. And so you go to the provider location for those. So that's just how we compare nationally. Again, this is a few years old, but it's still really kind of where we are with preschoolers. We haven't made as many strides in preschool as we have. We a little bit better in K-12 now, that we still lag. We're an outlier. We are more segregated than the rest of the nation on a lot of this stuff. So sampling of placements for preschoolers. The point of this is I wanted to illustrate that it is all over the place. It really depends on the local school district. So there really seems to be a variance of approaches. I would say there's also a variety of people who maybe do or not understand what some of the laws are, and locally where how much wherewithal they have to change what they're doing. So in Shoreline and Auburn and Tukwila, this is what they're doing. They've got the green, that's the regular program, supports in the program. So they're not quite at Colorado, but that's where they're going. They want supports in the program. A separate class or school, so a developmental program or a developmental preschool, not so much in Shoreline or Auburn, but yes, Mercer Island, they lean in on those. Highline, they lean in on those. Seattle, not as much, but yeah, they're still leaning in on those. A regular program supports elsewhere. I'm not exactly sure what Lake Washington's model is, but that's what they're doing. They have a regular program, so I don't know if it's just pull out. I don't know if I'm not sure how they're doing it. But they don't have a regular program supports in, but they do have pull out. So that's what you see there, and then other provider location. Shoreline, for some reason, has a really high number of other provider location. So does Mercer Island. And that could be because of things like as simple as childcare. Like maybe the program they have, maybe this is a regular program that's only a 3-hour a day, 2 or 3 hour program. And so a lot of people need to do something different because it doesn't work for them. But again, my point is just that it's all over the place. And this is where your sort of your advocacy and pointing out, what somebody's rights are, can really make a difference. And that is the end of the presentation, formal. I'm going to stop the recording. And then if anyone has